Some people spend their whole lives searching for someone who won't walk away. Others learn to expect the door to close before they even knock. Jake Morrison knows that second truth better than most. Standing 7 feet tall in the Colorado dust, he's been turned away from every door, every town, every chance at belonging for 20 years. His size makes people afraid. His gentle heart makes them uncomfortable. So he wanders alone, carrying the weight of 1,000 rejections. But today, something changes. A wild Mustang stands before him, beautiful and untamed. Every cowboy has tried to break this horse and failed. Jake doesn't reach for his rope. He extends a trembling hand and whispers the words that have echoed in his own heart for decades. Please don't turn me away like the others. What happens when two lonely souls finally find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado Territory stretched endlessly before Jake Morrison, its red rock canyons and purple mountains holding the same promise they'd whispered to broken men for decades. Here, where the air thinned and civilized thoughts seemed to scatter on the wind, a man could disappear entirely if he wanted to. And Jake Morrison had wanted to disappear for 20 years. At 7 feet and 2 inches, disappearing had never been easy. His shadow fell across doorways like a storm cloud, and his voice, despite its gentle cadence, rumbled from somewhere deep in his chest like distant thunder. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts when they saw him coming. Merchants calculated how much they could charge him for the privilege of their discomfort. And women, well, women simply looked away. In his shirt pocket, pressed against his heart, Jake carried the last photograph of the only person who had never looked away. His mother, Eleanor Morrison, smiled up from the faded sepia image, her eyes crinkled with the same kindness that Jake remembered from those precious early years in Tennessee. She had called him her gentle giant, had braided wildflowers into his dark hair while humming old hymns, had told him that his size was God's way of giving the world more room for love. The fire had taken her when Jake was 12, along with their little cabin on the hillside and everything else that had made life worth living. The scars still marked the left side of his face, pale lines that drew across his cheek like a map of that terrible night. His father had taken one look at him in the hospital, at the burns, at the guilt written in his son's eyes, and walked away. Just walked away, leaving Jake to recover alone among strangers who whispered about the boy who couldn't save his own mother. 20 years of wandering had followed. 20 years of odd jobs on ranches where his size made him valuable until his gentleness made him suspect. Cowboys didn't cry when horses got hurt. They didn't play harmonicas to calm frightened cattle. They didn't carry pressed flowers in their Bible or know the names of every wildflower from here to the Mississippi. Jake did all these things, and each one had cost him another job, another chance at belonging somewhere. The harmonica had been his father's, left behind in the ash of their old life. Jake had learned to play it during those first lonely years, finding that music could say things his words couldn't. Animals seemed to understand the language of melody better than human speech anyway. Horses would calm when he played the old songs his mother had hummed. Cattle would settle as notes drifted over the prairie wind. Even wild things, rabbits and deer, and once, memorably, a wounded mountain lion had paused to listen before deciding he meant no harm. It was this harmonica that had brought him to the Broken Arrow Ranch 3 days ago. Frank Patterson, the ranch owner, had been fighting with a string of horses that seemed determined to destroy every fence, gate, and stable on the property. His hired hands spoke in frustrated whispers about evil spirits and cursed animals. Jake had simply pulled out the harmonica and played, standing in the middle of the chaos while horses wheeled around him like dancers finding their rhythm. The effect had been immediate. Ears pricked forward instead of pinned back. nostrils flared with curiosity instead of fear. Within minutes, the entire herd had settled into watchful stillness, as if Jake were conducting some invisible orchestra. Frank Patterson was a practical man with practical problems. He didn't care if his new hand was 7 feet tall or if children crossed the street to avoid him. He cared that Jake could gentle a spooked bronco with nothing but patience and music. He cared that Jake worked harder than 3 men and never asked for more than beans and a place to sleep. Most importantly, he cared that Jake might be the only person alive who could handle his greatest problem. The Mustang Dot, she stood apart from the other horses, beautiful and terrible as a summer storm. Her coat was the color of burnished copper, catching fire in the morning light, and her eyes held the wild intelligence of something that had never bent to any man's will. For 2 years, she had been Frank's obsession and his despair. Every top hand in Colorado had tried to break her. She had broken them instead, sending grown men limping away with tales of supernatural strength and unholy rage. She killed a man once, Frank had told Jake on that first day, his voice heavy with old regret. Not from meanness, I don't think. From fear. She's been running wild so long, she's forgotten how to trust. If you can gentle her, there's a permanent place here for you. If you can't, he had shrugged, but Jake understood. Another failure. Another goodbye. But when Jake first laid eyes on the Mustang, standing alone in the far pasture like a queen in exile, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Not of her appearance, but of something deeper, the way she held herself apart from the herd, the wariness in her stance, the expectation of rejection in every line of her body. She looked at the world the way Jake looked at it, from a distance, with longing and distrust in equal measure. The other hands called her Diablo, a name that sat on her like an ill-fitting saddle. Jake thought of her simply as her, the way. He might think of a distant star or a half-remembered dream. Something beautiful and unreachable, something that existed in its own sphere of perfection. He had spent 3 days simply watching her, learning her patterns, understanding her fears. She grazed at dawn when the light was soft and the other horses were still drowsy. She drank from the stream at midday when the sun was high and she could see every shadow. She ran at sunset, not from anything but toward something, perhaps toward the memory of freedom, perhaps toward the hope of it. On this 4th morning, Jake approached her pasture as he had every morning, carrying nothing but his harmonica and the weight of his own loneliness. The Mustang lifted her head as he neared the fence, copper ears swiveling toward him with alert intelligence. They regarded each other across 30 yards of dry grass. 2 souls who understood the ache of isolation. Jake pulled the harmonica from his pocket and played a soft melody, something his mother had hummed while braiding his hair all those years ago. The notes drifted across the morning air like smoke, carrying with them all the gentleness his huge hands had never been allowed to offer, all the tenderness his scarred face had never been permitted to show. The Mustang took a step toward him, then another. Her movement was fluid as water, careful as prayer. Jake kept playing, pouring 20 years of rejection into the music, 20 years of doors closing and chances lost. But also hope, the fragile, persistent hope that somewhere in the world, someone might not turn away. When the song ended, they were only 10 feet apart. The Mustang's dark eyes searched his face, reading the scars and the sorrow, the fear and the desperate hunger for connection. In that moment, Jake understood that. She saw him not the giant, not the frightening stranger, but him, the boy who had braided wildflowers in his hair, the man who played lullabies to nervous cattle, the soul who had been walking wounded through the world, leaving pieces of himself at every rejection. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing. "The morning air. Please don't turn me away like the others." The Mustang stood perfectly still, her head tilted as if she were listening to something beyond words, something that lived in the space between heartbeats. Then, so slowly that Jake hardly dared to breathe, she lowered her magnificent head and took another step forward. The frayed rope hung coiled on the fence post like a sleeping snake. 30 feet of braided hemp worn smooth by countless hands and stained dark with the sweat and blood of broken dreams. Jake studied it as the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the pasture where the Mustang waited, still as a statue carved from living copper. Every cowboy who had tried to claim her had reached for that rope first. It was the traditional tool, the expected method: throw the loop, pull tight, and force submission through strength and stubbornness. The rope bore the scars of their failures. Frayed edges where desperate hands had gripped too tight. Dark stains where pride had met reality in violent collision. Jake's hands, large enough to palm a man's head, remained folded across the fence rail. The Mustang's eyes never left his face, reading something in his stillness that the others had never offered. She was close enough now that he could see the small scars along her flanks, pale lines that spoke of barbed wire and cruel spurs, of men who had believed that breaking required breaking. "You've been hurt," Jake said softly, his voice carrying no further than the space between them. "So have I." The admission hung in the air like morning mist. Jake had never spoken his pain aloud, not to the succession of foremen who had dismissed him, not to the townspeople who had crossed streets to avoid him, not even to himself during the long nights when loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight. But something about the Mustang's patient attention invited truth. "They wanted to make you something you're not," he continued, his scarred fingers tracing patterns on the weathered wood. "Tried to force you into a shape that felt wrong. I know that feeling." The Mustang's ears flicked forward, and Jake caught his breath. In 20 years of gentling animals, he had learned to read the subtle language of body and breath, the way a creature's entire being could shift between fear and curiosity in a single heartbeat. She was listening, not just to his words, but to something deeper, something that lived beneath the surface of speech. Behind them, Jake heard the approach of boots on dry earth. Frank Patterson's weathered face appeared at the pasture gate, followed by 2 of his hands, both young men who had learned their craft from harder teachers than Jake would ever be. Their eyes went immediately to the rope, then to Jake's empty hands, then to the impossible sight of the Mustang standing close enough to touch. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank breathed, his voice carefully neutral. "She's never let anyone get that close." Jake didn't turn around. The Mustang's attention was delicate as spider silk, easily broken if he showed the slightest change in intention. Instead, he kept his focus on her dark eyes, acknowledging the men's presence with only a slight nod. "You planning to use that rope?" asked Tommy, the younger hand, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. Tommy had been one of the Mustang's casualties, thrown hard enough to crack 2 ribs and bruise his pride even more thoroughly. "She's right there, Jake. You could have a loop on her before she knew what hit her." The Mustang's head lifted at Tommy's eager tone, nostrils flaring as she read the change in the air around them. Jake saw the moment when her muscles began to coil, when the wild part of her spirit prepared to flee from the familiar threat of masculine ambition. "No rope," Jake said quietly, his words meant for the Mustang as much as the men. "No force. No breaking. And how the hell are you planning to gentle her?" The second hand, a grizzled man named Pete, who bore his own scars from encounters with difficult horses, stepped forward with professional skepticism. "That Mustang's had every trick tried on her. Ropes, whips, hobbles, blindfolding, nothing works. She's too wild, too set in her ways. Sometimes a horse just can't be saved." Jake finally turned to face them, his movements slow and deliberate. The Mustang shifted but didn't flee, as if his continued gentleness had earned him the benefit of her doubt. "Maybe nobody tried asking," Jake said. The men exchanged glances that Jake had seen 1,000 times before, the look that said he was too soft, too different, too naive to understand how the real world worked. It was the same look that had followed him from job to job, the expression that preceded every dismissal, every closed door, every goodbye. Frank Patterson studied his newest hand with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent 40 years evaluating horses and men in equal measure. The Mustang had cost him money, time, and reputation. 2 years of failed attempts had left him with an animal that was beautiful, valuable, and utterly useless. "You've got 2 weeks," Frank said, finally. "If you can gentle her without breaking her spirit, she's yours to train. If you can't," he shrugged. But Jake heard the unspoken ultimatum. Another chance exhausted. Another place to leave behind. "And if I try to force her?" Jake asked, though he already knew his answer. "Then you're no different than the rest of them," Frank replied. "And I'll find someone who is." The men departed, their voices fading into the distance as they debated Jake's chances and methods. But Jake's attention had already returned to the Mustang, who had watched the entire exchange with the alert intelligence of someone accustomed to being the subject of human decisions made without her consent. "They want to give you to me," Jake said, reaching slowly into his shirt pocket, "like you're something that can be owned. But I know better." His fingers found the photograph of his mother, worn soft by 20 years of carrying. He held it up so the Mustang could see, though he knew she couldn't understand the image the way he did. What mattered was the gentleness in his gesture, the reverence with which he treated the small piece of paper. "This was the last person who saw me for who I really am," he said. "She told me that love isn't something you take. It's something you're given, if you're patient enough to wait for it." The Mustang lowered her head, studying the photograph with curious eyes. Jake held perfectly still, letting her investigate this glimpse into his private world. Her breath was warm against his fingers, and he caught the wild scent of her sage and summer storms and something indefinably free. "I won't try to own you," Jake whispered. "I won't try to break you. But if you're willing, maybe we could learn to trust each other. Maybe we could stop being alone." The Mustang lifted her eyes to his face, and Jake saw something shift in there. Dark depths. Not surrender, she was too proud for that. Too strong to be conquered by gentle words and patient gestures. But recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that here was someone who understood what it meant to carry wounds that never quite healed, who knew the weight of expectations that could never be met. She stepped closer, close enough that Jake could have reached out and touched her neck, could have slipped a rope around her if he had been the kind of man who conquered rather than courted. Instead, he remained motionless, offering nothing but his presence and the promise that he would wait as long as it took for her to choose him. The moments stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Then the Mustang did something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She nickered, soft and low, the sound a horse makes when greeting a friend. For the first time in 20 years, Jake Morrison felt the possibility that someone might not turn him away. The leather journal had cost Jake 2 days' wages in Denver, back when he'd had foolish hopes about documenting his travels like some kind of explorer. For 3 years, it had remained empty, a brown leather witness to his inability to put words to the loneliness that followed him from town to town. But on this 5th morning with the Mustang, Jake found himself reaching for the weathered book and a stubby pencil, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Day 1, he wrote in his careful, deliberate script. She didn't run. The words looked strange on the page, too simple to capture the miracle of that first moment when the Mustang had chosen to stay rather than flee. But Jake had learned that truth often lived in simple things in the way morning light caught a horse's eye, in the particular silence that fell when a wild thing decided to trust. Day 2, she came closer. Close enough to smell my fear. Because he had been afraid, Jake realized now. Afraid that she would see through his gentleness. to the desperate hunger underneath, the need that had driven him across half the continent in search of something that wouldn't turn away. The Mustang had seen it anyway, had somehow understood that his fear wasn't of her but for her, for the possibility that this fragile connection might shatter like all the others. Day 3. I played the harmonica. She listened. The memory of that morning filled Jake with warmth, even as he wrote. The Mustang had stood utterly still while he played his mother's lullaby, her head tilted as if she were trying to understand not just the melody, but the man behind it. When the song ended, she had remained in place for nearly an hour, as if reluctant to break the spell of shared silence. Day 4. She spoke to me. That soft nicker still echoed in Jake's memory, the first voluntary sound she had made in his presence. It had been tentative, questioning, the equine equivalent of hello, offered to a stranger who might prove worthy of friendship. Jake had responded with his own quiet greeting, and for just a moment, they had been two creatures acknowledging each other's existence without fear or judgment. Now, on the 5th morning, Jake sat on the fence rail with the journal balanced on his knee, documenting the small miracles that others might dismiss as mere animal behavior. But Jake understood that there was nothing mere about the way the Mustang had begun to graze closer to his section of fence. Nothing simple about how she would lift her head to check his location before relaxing into the rhythm of eating. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant snow from the high peaks, mixing with the earthier smells of hay and leather that defined ranch life. Jake breathed deeply, trying to memorize this moment when hope felt larger than fear, when possibility stretched before him like an unbroken horizon. Writing poetry now, are we? The voice belonged to Pete, the older hand who had made no secret of his skepticism about Jake's methods. He approached the fence with the careful gait of a man whose joints had absorbed too many years of hard riding and harder falls. Just keeping track, Jake replied mildly, closing the journal without embarrassment. He had learned long ago that shame was a luxury he couldn't afford. It took too much energy from the work of simply surviving. Pete studied the Mustang, who had lifted her head at his approach but hadn't moved away. She's looking better, he admitted grudgingly. Calmer. Usually, she'd be at the far end of the pasture by now, planning her next escape attempt. It was true. The Mustang's posture had subtly shifted over the past few days, from the coiled tension of a creature ready to bolt to something more settled, more curious. She watched the men without the wild edge that had characterized her earlier interactions with humans. You really think you can gentle her without breaking her? Pete asked, and Jake heard genuine curiosity beneath the challenge. I don't want to gentle her, Jake said, the words coming from a place deeper than conscious thought. I want to befriend her. Pete was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands working at a piece of tack that didn't need attention. 40 years I've been working horses, he said finally. Started when I was younger than Tommy. Thought I knew everything there was to know about making an animal do what you wanted. Took me half a lifetime to learn the difference between a broken horse and a willing one. Jake looked at the older man with new interest. Pete's methods were traditional, often harsh, but his horses worked with solid reliability, if not enthusiasm. It had never occurred to Jake that the man might have his own doubts about the way things had always been done. This Mustang, she's something special, Pete continued. Not just her bloodlines, though those are fine enough. It's her spirit. Most horses, you can see the moment when they give in, when they decide it's easier to obey than to fight. But her, she's never given in to anything. Question is whether that makes her stronger or just more dangerous. The Mustang had drifted closer during their conversation, drawn by the calm tones and lack of aggressive posturing. She stood perhaps 20 feet away, near enough that Jake could see the intelligent curiosity in her dark eyes, the way she seemed to evaluate not just their words, but their intentions. She's not dangerous, Jake said quietly. She's careful. There's a difference. As if to prove his point, The Mustang took 2 deliberate steps closer, her movement fluid and controlled. She wasn't approaching from desperation or submission, but from choice, a conscious decision to investigate these humans who spoke without shouting, who moved without grabbing. Pete let out a low whistle of surprise. In all the time she's been here, I've never seen her come that close to 2 people at once. Usually more than one human sends her running for the hills. Jake opened his journal again, making a quick note. Day 5. She's learning that humans can be different from each other. Some threaten, some listen. You really think that matters? Pete asked, reading over Jake's shoulder. What you writing there? Jake considered the question, thinking of all the things he had never written down, all the moments of beauty and pain that had passed through his life without witness. I spent 20 years disappearing, he said. Maybe it's time I started keeping track of where I've been, what I've learned. The Mustang had moved closer still, near enough now that Jake could see the small details that made her individual. The white star on her forehead shaped like a lightning bolt. The way her left ear bore a small notch from some long-ago encounter. With barbed wire, the particular way she held her tail when she was curious rather than alarmed. She's beautiful, Pete said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice. Shame to think of her running wild until she's too old to matter to anyone. Maybe running wild isn't the worst thing, Jake replied. Maybe the worst thing is being tamed by someone who doesn't understand what they're taking away. The Mustang lifted her head, looking directly at Jake as if she had heard and understood. In her gaze, he saw acknowledgement, not gratitude, which would have implied debt, but recognition. She saw him as clearly as he saw her, damaged, wary, but still capable of hope. Jake wrote one more line in his journal. She knows. I won't take anything she doesn't give. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the pasture, the Mustang settled into grazing near the fence where Jake sat. Not approaching, not retreating, but simply existing in the same space. A small miracle that Jake documented with careful words and careful hope, marking this day as different from all the days of loneliness that had come before. The wild apples lay scattered beneath the old tree at the edge of the pasture like nature's own offering, small and imperfect but sweet with the concentrated flavor of things that grew without human intervention. Jake gathered them slowly, his large hands gentle with the windfall fruit, aware that he was crossing some invisible threshold between observer and participant in the Mustang's world. For a week, he had been content to sit and watch, to play his harmonica and write in his journal, to exist as a benevolent presence at the margins of her daily routine. But this morning, something in her posture suggested a readiness for more, a subtle shift in the way she grazed near the fence. The manner in which her ears tracked his movement even when her head was down. Jake approached the fence with a handful of apples, their red and gold skin catching the early light. The Mustang lifted her head immediately, nostrils flaring as she caught the scent. Wild apples were a rare treat in this high country, something she would have encountered only during her free-roaming days in the mountain meadows. I thought you might remember these, Jake said softly, settling onto his usual perch on the fence rail. Bet you know every apple tree between here and the Continental Divide. The Mustang's ears pricked forward with unmistakable interest. She took a step toward the fence, then another, her movement deliberate and considered. Jake held one of the apples in his open palm, arm extended but not reaching, letting her make the choice about whether to close the distance between them. For long minutes, they remained frozen in that tableau man offering, horse deciding. Jake felt the weight of the moment, understanding that this was more than sharing food. This was the first test of whether she trusted him enough to put herself within reach, to make herself vulnerable to hands that could grab as easily as give. The Mustang stepped closer, her neck stretching toward the offered apple. Jake could feel her warm breath against his palm, could see the careful intelligence in her dark eyes as she evaluated not just the fruit but his intentions. Then, with delicate precision, she took the apple from his hand, her lips soft against his skin as she claimed her prize. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The contact had lasted only seconds, but it felt like a covenant, a mutual agreement that gentleness would be met with trust. The Mustang crunched the apple with obvious pleasure, juice running down her chin as she savored the unexpected treat. "Good?" Jake asked, reaching for another apple. This time, she came forward more readily, the initial barrier of contact already broken. As she ate the second apple, Jake became aware of someone approaching from behind, footsteps too light to belong to any of the ranch hands. She's never done that before. The voice was feminine, warm with wonder and something that sounded like relief. Jake turned to see a woman watching from a few yards away, her auburn hair caught in a simple braid, and her clothes practical but well-maintained. She had the sun-weathered skin of someone who spent her days outdoors, but her hands were clean, and her posture spoke of education and refinement. "Sarah Patterson," she said, stepping closer. "Frank's daughter. I've been watching your progress." From the house. Jake nodded politely, aware that the Mustang had tensed at the newcomer's presence, but hadn't bolted. "Jake Morrison, your father gave me a chance with her." "He gave you 2 weeks," Sarah corrected, settling onto the fence several feet away from Jake. Her movement was careful, designed not to startle the horse. "It's been 8 days. People in town are starting to talk about the giant who thinks he can charm the devil horse with music and apples." There was no mockery in her tone, but Jake felt the familiar weight of being discussed, evaluated, found curious by people who saw his differences before they saw his humanity. "And what do you think?" he asked. Sarah studied the Mustang, who was eyeing the remaining apples with obvious hope. "I think she looks happier than she has in 2 years. Calmer, like she's remembering what it feels like to not be afraid all the time." The observation was astute, and Jake found himself looking at Sarah with new attention. Most people saw the Mustang's wildness as defiance or evil temper. It took insight to recognize it as a response to trauma, a protective shell built around wounds that had never been allowed to heal. "You know horses," Jake said. "I grew up here. My mother taught me to ride before I could properly walk." Sarah's voice carried a note of old sadness. She had a way with difficult animals too. Said the broken ones just needed someone to show them they could trust again. Jake offered the Mustang another apple, and this time she stepped close enough that he could have touched her neck if he'd been inclined to push the boundaries of their new accord. Instead, he kept his focus on feeding her, on maintaining the gentle rhythm they'd established. "Your mother sounds wise," he said. "She was. Lost her when I was 16. Fever took her during a hard winter. Left me to help my father keep this place running." Sarah's hands worked unconsciously at a piece of leather, fashioning what looked like a simple lead rope. "I've been watching. You work with her every morning. You have the same patience my mother had, the same understanding that some things can't be forced." The Mustang finished the third apple and looked hopefully at Jake's hands, which still held 2 more. He smiled at her obvious greed, charmed by this glimpse of personality beneath the wild exterior. "She's got an appetite," Sarah observed with amusement. "For more than apples, I think," Jake replied, offering the 4th piece of fruit. "She's hungry for connection, for someone to see her as more than a problem to be solved." As if understanding his words, the Mustang stepped even closer, close enough that Jake could see the individual whiskers around her muzzle, the way her nostrils fluttered with each breath. When she took the apple this time, she lingered for a moment, her soft nose brushing against his palm in what felt like gratitude. "She likes you," Sarah said softly. "I mean really likes you, not just tolerates you. There's a difference." Jake knew there was, had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished genuine acceptance from mere resignation. The Mustang's entire bearing had changed over the past week, less guarded, more curious, willing to investigate rather than simply endure. "The feeling's mutual," Jake admitted, offering the last apple. "I've been alone a long time. It's nice to have someone who doesn't see my size as something to fear." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when Jake glanced at her, he saw understanding in her green eyes. "You've had a hard road," she said. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. "Haven't we all?" Jake replied, but without bitterness. He had learned that pain was universal. Only the details varied from person to person. The Mustang finished her apple and remained close, seemingly reluctant to return to her grazing. Jake sat perfectly still, letting her decide what came next, aware that Sarah was watching their interaction with the focused attention of someone who understood horses well enough to appreciate what she was seeing. "She trusts you," Sarah said. "Finally, really trusts you. I wasn't sure it was possible." "Trust has to be earned," Jake said, reaching slowly into his pocket for his harmonica. "And it has to be given freely, or it's not really trust at all." He played a soft melody, something his mother had hummed while working in their garden all those years ago. The Mustang's ears swiveled toward the music, and she settled into a comfortable stance, no longer alert for danger, but simply present. In the moment, when the song ended, Sarah spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "My father's been worried about what to do with her if this doesn't work. He can't keep a horse that can't be ridden, can't afford to feed an animal that serves no purpose." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "And if I succeed, then you'll have proven something that most people thought was impossible," Sarah said. "That some things are worth saving, even when they seem beyond hope." The Mustang nickered softly, the sound carrying across the morning air like a promise. Jake looked into her intelligent eyes and saw not a broken thing to be fixed, but a spirit that had simply been waiting for someone to approach with open hands instead of closed fists. "She's not beyond hope," Jake said quietly. "She's just been waiting for someone to see her clearly." As the sun climbed higher, the Mustang finally stepped away to resume her grazing, but she remained close, within the circle of trust they had begun to build together. Jake watched her with quiet satisfaction, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them, that the foundation of friendship had been laid with nothing more than patience, apples, and the recognition that some gifts could only be given, never taken. The storm announced itself with a wall of black clouds that rolled across the Colorado peaks like the advance guard of some celestial army. Jake felt the change in the air pressure before he saw the lightning, a heaviness that pressed against his chest and made the Mustang lift her head with sudden alertness. They had been sharing their morning routine apples and gentle conversation when the first rumble of thunder echoed across the valley like a warning. The Mustang's entire body went rigid, her copper coat rippling with tension as ancient instincts screamed at her to run. Jake had seen this reaction before in horses caught in sudden weather, but with her, it was magnified by years of surviving alone in the wild, where storms meant exposure, danger, and the constant threat of predators drawn by the chaos. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "It's just noise. Just sky having a conversation with itself." But the Mustang was beyond the reach of soothing words. Her eyes rolled white with terror, and she backed away. From the fence, every muscle coiled for flight. Jake understood her fear in the wild. A horse caught in the open during a mountain storm could die from lightning strikes, flash floods, or simply from exhaustion after hours of panicked running. The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dry earth with audible impacts. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a drumming, then a roar as the Colorado sky opened in earnest. Jake pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, But instead of seeking shelter in the barn as common sense dictated, he climbed over the fence into the pasture. The Mustang wheeled away from him, her hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground, as she fought against the ancient terror that urged her to run until her heart burst. Jake approached slowly, water streaming from his hat brim, his large frame somehow managing to project calm despite the violence of the storm around them. "I'm not going anywhere," he called to her over the thunder. "You don't have to face this alone." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the pasture in stark white relief for one electric moment. The Mustang screamed a sound of pure terror that cut through Jake's heart like a blade. She reared, striking at the air as if she could fight the storm itself, and Jake saw in that moment all the nights she had endured alone. All the times fear had been her only companion. Without conscious thought, Jake pulled his coat from his shoulders and approached the terrified horse. She shied away, but he persisted, his movements slow and deliberate despite the rain that now fell in sheets. When he was close enough, he draped the heavy wool coat over her back, covering her shoulders and neck with whatever protection he could offer. The gesture was small, almost ridiculous in the face of nature's fury, but its meaning was enormous. Jake had given up his own shelter, his own warmth, to shield her from the storm. The Mustang stood trembling beneath the makeshift blanket, her eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been wonder. "There," Jake said, his voice steady despite the cold rain that soaked through his shirt within seconds. "Now we'll weather it together." He settled onto the ground beside her, cross-legged in the mud, close enough to provide presence, but not so close as to crowd her. The Mustang looked down at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that might have been the beginning of love. Thunder crashed overhead, so close that Jake felt it in his bones. But the Mustang no longer shied. Instead, she lowered her head until her muzzle nearly touched his shoulder, accepting his protection and his presence as gifts beyond price. They sat together in the fury of the storm, man and horse sharing warmth and courage while the sky raged around them. From the ranch house, Sarah Patterson watched through the kitchen window, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she witnessed something she had never expected to see. The giant stranger sat in the storm like some ancient guardian, keeping vigil over a horse that had never trusted anyone enough to accept help. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, his shirt transparent with rain, but his posture spoke of absolute commitment, the stance of someone who would endure whatever was necessary to prove that he could be counted on. "That man's going to catch his death," Frank Patterson said, joining his daughter at the window. "All for a horse that's probably not worth half what I've got invested in her feed." "Look at her, Pa," Sarah said softly. "Really look at her." Frank peered through the rain-lashed glass and saw what his daughter meant. The Mustang stood perfectly still despite the lightning and thunder, her head lowered in a gesture of trust that she had never shown to any human being. Jake's coat covered her back like a blessing, and her entire posture spoke of acceptance, of allowing herself to be protected for the first time in her wild life. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered. "She's letting him help her." "More than that," Sarah said, understanding something fundamental about what she was witnessing. "She's letting herself need him." The storm raged for 3 hours, and Jake never moved from his position beside the Mustang. He talked to her sometimes, his voice a counterpoint to the thunder, telling her stories about his mother's garden and the songs she used to sing during Tennessee thunderstorms. He played his harmonica when the lightning paused, soft melodies that seemed to wrap around them both like additional shelter dot by the time the clouds began to break, revealing patches of blue sky like promises of better weather. Both man and horse were soaked to the skin. Jake's lips were blue with cold, his hands stiff from the chill, but his eyes held a warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature. The Mustang lifted her head as the last drops of rain fell, and Jake saw himself reflected in her dark eyes, not the giant that frightened children, Not the strange loner that made townspeople uncomfortable, but simply a friend who had proven himself worthy of trust. She nuzzled his shoulder gently, a gesture of gratitude and affection that made his throat tight with emotion. "We made it through," Jake said, his voice hoarse from the cold and damp. "Both of us." As he stood to retrieve his coat, the Mustang did something extraordinary. She followed him, staying close to his side as if reluctant to break the bond they had forged in the crucible of the storm. When Jake draped the wet wool over his shoulders, she pressed against him, sharing what warmth they could generate together. Sarah appeared at the pasture gate with a thick blanket and a steaming cup of coffee, her green eyes bright with understanding. "You look like you could use these," she said, climbing through the fence to join them. Jake accepted the offerings gratefully, but he didn't step away from the Mustang, who showed no signs of reverting to her former wariness. Instead, she seemed to accept Sarah's presence as part of the expanded circle of trust that now included the man who had chosen to weather the storm at her side. "She's different," Sarah observed, studying the horse's relaxed posture. "The way she's standing, the way she's looking at you, it's like she's finally decided you're family." Jake sipped the hot coffee, feeling it chase the chill from his bones, and considered Sarah's words. Family. It was a concept he had almost forgotten, a belonging he had given up hope of finding. But as the Mustang pressed closer to his side, claiming him as surely as he had claimed her, Jake began to believe that sometimes the family you needed found you in the most unexpected places. The afternoon sun broke through the dispersing clouds, painting the wet pasture in shades of gold and green. Steam rose from the earth, carrying the clean scent of rain-washed air and new possibilities. And in the center of it all, a broken man and a wild horse stood together, no longer alone in a world that had often seemed too harsh to bear. The leather was butter-soft in Jake's hands, supple from years of careful conditioning and use. He had purchased it from a traveling merchant with 2 weeks' wages, recognizing the quality that would be necessary for what he had in mind. This would not be a halter designed to restrain or control, but something altogether different to bridge between human intention and equine consent, a symbol of partnership rather than dominion. Jake worked by lamplight in the barn's tack room, his large fingers surprisingly deft as they braided and stitched, creating something that had never existed before. Every traditional halter he had ever seen was designed with the assumption that a horse would eventually resist. That force would be necessary to maintain control. This halter he was crafting operated on a different philosophy entirely. It would guide only when the horse was willing to be guided, would hold only when she chose to be held. The Mustang watched him from her stall, a recent development that still amazed the entire ranch. 3 days after the storm, she had followed Jake into the barn voluntarily. Curious about this indoor world she had always avoided, Frank Patterson had built the stall with reinforced walls and heavy locks, anticipating a wild animal's desperation to escape. Instead, the Mustang had explored her new quarters with the careful attention of someone investigating a potential home. "You know what I'm making, don't you?" Jake asked softly, holding up the partially completed halter. The leather gleamed in the lamplight, unmarked by metal studs or harsh buckles. "This is for you if you want it, but only if you want it." The Mustang stepped closer to the stall door, her neck stretched toward the strange device that smelled of new leather and Jake's familiar hands. Her nostrils fluttered with curiosity, reading layers of information that humans could never access. The confidence in Jake's scent, the care with which he handled the leather, the absence of any fear or aggression in his movements. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the tack room, her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes soft with something Jake couldn't quite identify. She had been spending more time at the barn lately, drawn by the extraordinary transformation taking place between man and horse. Her presence had become as natural as the morning sun, a comfortable addition to the small world Jake was building around his growing friendship with the Mustang. "That's beautiful work," she said, settling onto a wooden crate to watch him braid. "Where did you learn to work leather like that?" Jake's hands paused for a moment, memory flickering across his scarred features. "My mother," he said quietly. "She made harnesses for the farmers around our place in Tennessee. Said that anything you put on a horse should be made with love, because the animal would feel the intention in the leather." Sarah studied the halter with new understanding, seeing not just the craftsmanship but the philosophy behind it. Every stitch spoke of reverence, every piece of leather chosen for comfort rather than durability. This was not a tool of control, but an invitation to partnership. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Sarah said. She was. Jake resumed his braiding, his voice carrying the warm sadness of old grief transformed into gratitude. She believed that gentleness was a choice, not a weakness. That the strongest people were the ones who could be soft when softness was needed. The Mustang nickered softly, as if she understood that they were discussing her as much as Jake's mother. She had begun to make small sounds in Jake's presence, not the screams of fear that had once characterized her interactions with humans, but gentle communications that spoke of contentment and curiosity. "She's talking to you," Sarah observed with wonder. "I've never heard her make sounds like that." Jake looked up from his work to meet the Mustang's intelligent gaze. "She's got things to say. Just took a while to find someone who would listen." As he spoke, Jake realized that the same could be said about himself. For 20 years, he had carried thoughts and feelings that had no outlet, no safe recipient. His journal had been a start, but there was something different about having living witnesses to his words, beings who heard not just his voice but his meaning. "I used to think I was too different to belong anywhere," Jake said, his hands never stopping their careful work. "Too big, too gentle, too strange for the world as it is. But maybe the world just needed time to catch up to a different way of being." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. "Being different, I mean. After my mother died, I had to become someone else overnight, part daughter, part ranch, and part business partner to my father. Never quite fitting any role completely." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Jake looked at her with new understanding, seeing past the competent exterior to the young woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to hold her family's world together. "What did you want to be?" he asked. "Before you had to become everything else?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden crate. "A teacher," she said finally. "I wanted to work with children, help them see that learning could be joyful instead of just necessary. Foolish dream for a ranch girl with responsibilities." "Not foolish," Jake said firmly. "Necessary. The world needs people who remember that gentleness matters, that patience can accomplish what force never could." As if to illustrate his point, the Mustang extended her neck as far as the stall door would allow, her nose nearly touching the halter in Jake's hands. She investigated the leather with careful attention, her breath warm against the supple material. "She wants to try it," Sarah said, amazement coloring her voice. Jake stood slowly, the completed halter in his hands. It was a thing of beauty, every line flowing naturally into the next, every piece positioned for maximum comfort. The noseband was padded with lamb's wool, the crown piece designed to distribute pressure evenly, the lead attachment placed where it would suggest rather than demand. "Only if you're ready," Jake said to the Mustang, holding the halter where she could see and smell it. "This is your choice, not mine." The Mustang studied the leather apparatus with the focused attention she gave to everything that might affect her safety or comfort. Jake waited, knowing that this moment would define the nature of their relationship going forward. He could put the halter on her by force. She was in a stall now, confined enough that two determined humans could overpower her resistance. But that would destroy everything they had built together, would reduce their friendship to the same pattern of dominance and submission that had characterized her past. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the Mustang stepped forward and lowered her head, positioning herself to receive the halter. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the soft leather over her ears, adjusting the fit with infinite care. The Mustang stood perfectly still, trusting him to handle her in this moment of vulnerability. When the halter was in place, Jake stepped back to admire his work. The Mustang looked magnificent, the golden leather complementing her copper coat, the simple design enhancing rather than hiding her natural beauty. But more than that, she looked willing, not resigned or defeated, but ready to explore what partnership might mean. "She's beautiful," Sarah breathed, and Jake heard something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. In the lamplight, with her hair catching golden highlights and her eyes soft with emotion, Sarah was beautiful too, not just in the way that any pretty woman might be beautiful, but with the deeper beauty of someone whose heart was open to wonder. "Yes," Jake said quietly, though he found himself looking at Sarah rather than the horse. "She is." The Mustang moved her head experimentally, testing the feel of the halter, learning how the leather responded to her movements. Jake had attached a long, soft lid rope that pulled on the stall floor, another invitation rather than a restraint. If she wanted to move away, she could do so easily. If she wanted to come closer, the rope would allow that too. What she chose to do surprised them both. The Mustang stepped forward until her nose touched Jake's chest, then rested her head against his shoulder in a gesture of complete trust. The weight of her acceptance pressed against Jake's heart, and he felt tears prick at his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being chosen by someone who mattered. "She loves you," Sarah said softly, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood exactly how that felt. The wanted poster lay flat on Frank Patterson's desk like a dead thing, its yellowed edges curled with age and its ink faded but still legible. 20 years of Colorado sun streaming through the ranch house windows had done nothing to obscure the face that stared up from the paper, younger, unscared, but unmistakably the same features that belonged to the gentle giant who had transformed their wild Mustang into a willing partner. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words beneath the crude sketch. Wanted for murder. Jake Morrison, age 18. Wanted in connection with the death of Eleanor Morrison, Knoxville, Tennessee. $500 reward. She had come into her father's office looking for the deed to the south pasture, something mundane and expected. Instead, she had found this fragment of Jake's past tucked between old ranch records and forgotten correspondence. Her father must have received it years ago, along with dozens of other such notices that drifted west with every mail delivery. Circulars about criminals and fugitives who might seek refuge in the vast anonymity of the frontier. The photograph attached to the poster showed a different Jake Morrison, this one clean-shaven and hollow-eyed, his face unmarked by the scars that now drew across his left cheek. But the eyes were the same, gentle, even in their printed reproduction, holding the same patient sadness that had drawn Sarah to the man who played harmonicas to horses and wrote poetry in leather-bound journals. The murder victim's name struck Sarah like a physical blow. Eleanor Morrison. The same name Jake had whispered when he spoke of his mother, the woman whose photograph he carried pressed against his heart. According to this poster, Jake Morrison was wanted for killing the person he loved most in the world. Sarah sank into her father's chair, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the man she had come to know with the accused killer described in the faded print. The Jake Morrison who had sat in a storm to comfort a frightened horse, who crafted leather halters with infinite patience, who spoke of his mother with reverence and grief. That man seemed incapable of violence against anyone, let alone the woman who had taught him gentleness. But the evidence lay before her in black and white. 20 years old but damning in its accusations. Wanted for murder. A price on his head. A past that he had never mentioned. A truth that recontextualized every moment of their growing friendship. The sound of voices outside drew Sarah to the window, where she saw Jake in the corral with the Mustang, working through the slow process of teaching her to accept a rider's weight. He moved with infinite patience, his voice a continuous murmur of encouragement as the horse learned to trust his presence on her back. There was nothing threatening in his posture, nothing that suggested violence or deception. But then, Sarah thought with a chill, what did a killer look like? What did someone carry 20 years of running? 20 years of hiding from a crime that had defined his entire adult life. Sarah? You in there? Frank Patterson's voice carried from the front porch, followed by the sound of boots on wooden steps. Sarah quickly folded the poster and slipped it into her pocket, her heart hammering as she tried to compose herself. By the time her father entered the office, she was standing at the window with what she hoped looked like casual interest. Just watching Jake work with the Mustang, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. He's got her accepting a saddle. Now. Frank joined her at the window, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he watched his investment finally begin to pay dividends. Never seen anything like it, he admitted. 2 weeks ago, that horse was an expensive problem. Now she's looking like she might actually earn her keep. What do you know about Jake's past? Sarah asked, trying to keep the question casual. Before he came here, I mean. Frank shrugged, his attention still on the training session outside. Same as most drifters who end up here. Hard luck somewhere else, looking for a fresh start. Don't ask too many questions about where a man's been, long as he can do the work I need done. But what if? Sarah began, then stopped. What if what? What if the man who had shown her what gentleness looked like was running from murder? What if the trust she had been building with him was founded on a lie? What if what? Frank prompted. Finally turning to look at his daughter, Sarah felt the weight of the poster in her pocket, the knowledge burning like a coal against her chest. What if someone's past caught up with them? What if the law came looking? Frank studied her with the sharp attention that had made him successful in business and survival. You know something I don't? The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications. Sarah could produce the poster, could show her father the evidence that would change everything. Jake would be arrested, probably hanged if the charges were true. The Mustang would lose the only person who had ever understood her. And Sarah would lose, what would she lose? The friendship of a man who might be a killer? The possibility of love with someone whose entire identity might be built on deception? Or would she lose the only person who had ever seen her clearly, who had recognized her loneliness as clearly as she had recognized his? Would she destroy the man who had taught her that gentleness was strength, that patience could accomplish what force never could? Sarah, Frank said more firmly, if you know something about Jake that affects this ranch, I need to know what it is. Through the window, Sarah watched Jake dismount and stroke the Mustang's neck, his movements fluid with the confidence that came from mutual trust. The horse nuzzled his shoulder, seeking the apple treats he always carried, and Jake laughed, sound of pure joy that Sarah had never heard from him before. I don't know anything, she said finally, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. I was just thinking out loud. Frank accepted her answer with a nod, but Sarah saw the question mark that lingered in his eyes. He was a careful man, suspicious by nature and protective of what was his. If he started asking questions about Jake's past, started making inquiries, in town or sending letters to law enforcement, I should get back to my chores, Sarah said, moving toward the door with what she hoped looked like normal purpose. Sarah. Frank's voice stopped her at the threshold. That man's been good for this place, good for that horse. But if there's something I should know about him, something that could bring trouble to our door, I trust you to tell me." Sarah met her father's gaze and nodded, hating herself for the deception, but unable to find an alternative. That didn't destroy everything good that had grown from Jake's presence on the ranch. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything beyond the weight of knowledge in her pocket. She helped with dinner preparations mechanically, her responses to her father's conversation distracted and brief. When Jake appeared at the kitchen door, asking about liniment for the Mustang's legs, Sarah could barely meet his eyes. "She's working harder than she has in years," Jake explained to Frank, accepting the bottle of arnica solution. "Want to make sure she doesn't get sore from the training." "Sensible," Frank agreed. "How much longer before she's ready for real riding?" Jake considered the question with the careful attention he gave to everything concerning the Mustang. "Another week, maybe 2. She's willing now, but I want to be sure she's confident before we ask for more." "No rush," Frank said, but Sarah heard the underlying satisfaction in his voice. A rideable Mustang represented significant financial value, a return on the investment of feed and care. Better to take the time now than to rush and ruin all the progress you've made. After Jake left, Sarah sat on the front porch in the gathering twilight, the poster burning in her pocket like a guilty secret. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of lamplight from the barn, where Jake was probably writing in his journal or playing his harmonica for the Mustang's enjoyment. 20 years he had been running. 20 years of isolation and rejection, of being turned away from every place he tried to call home. And now, just when he had found acceptance, just when the wounds were beginning to heal, the past was reaching out to claim him. Sarah pulled the poster from her pocket and studied it, again in the fading light. The young face in the drawing looked lost, desperate, guilty of something that had aged him beyond his years. But guilty of murder? Guilty of killing his own mother? As she sat in the darkness, Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could preserve Jake's secret and protect the fragile happiness he had built here, or she could expose the truth and let justice take its course, whatever the cost. The Mustang's soft whinny carried across the night air, followed by Jake's gentle laughter. Somewhere in the barn, a man who might be a killer was singing lullabies to a horse who had learned to trust again. Sarah folded the poster carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. The decision made, but not yet spoken. Whatever Jake Morrison had done 20 years ago, whatever truth lay behind the fated accusations, she would give him the chance to tell her himself. But first, she had to find the courage to ask. The Bible had been his mother's, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of faithful handling. Jake hadn't opened it since the night she died, had carried it from place to place like a talisman he couldn't bear to touch. But tonight, alone in the barn with the Mustang drowsing in her stall nearby, he found himself reaching for the book with trembling fingers. Between the pages of Psalms, exactly where he remembered leaving them, lay the pressed flowers his mother had collected during their last spring together. Violets and wild roses, their colors faded to whispers of what they had once been, but still holding the memory of her gentle hands and patient instruction. "Beauty doesn't last forever," she had told him while pressing the petals between sheets of wax paper, "but it leaves something behind that does." Jake touched the fragile blooms with infinite care, remembering the woman who had taught him that strength could be gentle, that kindness was never weakness. Eleanor Morrison had been barely 5 feet tall, but her presence had filled rooms. Her voice had calmed fractious animals and frightened children. Her hands had healed wounds both visible and hidden. The memory of that last night still haunted his dreams 20 years later. The smell of smoke, the crackle of flames, his own 12-year-old voice screaming for help that came too late. He had tried to reach her, had fought against the neighbor who pulled him back from the burning cabin, had watched helplessly as the roof collapsed and took with it everything that had made his world worth living in. The fire marshal had called it suspicious. The neighbors had whispered about insurance money and convenient timing. And his father had looked at Jake's soot-stained face and burn-scarred hands and seen guilt written in ash and grief. By the time the wanted posters were printed, Jake was already running, already disappearing into the vast anonymity of the frontier, where a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work hard and keep his mouth shut. 20 years of running. 20 years of carrying the weight of accusations he couldn't disprove, of knowing that somewhere behind him, the law still considered him a killer. 20 years of believing that maybe they were right, that maybe he could have saved her if he had been braver, stronger, faster. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the Mustang's breathing and the familiar scent of hay and leather, Jake found himself opening to a passage his mother had marked in her careful script. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Underneath the verse, in her flowing handwriting, she had written, "For my gentle giant, who carries more love in his heart than the world knows how to receive. Remember that forgiveness begins with forgiving yourself, and courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite it." Jake's throat tightened as he read the words that seemed to speak directly across the decades. A message from the woman who had known him better than anyone before or since. She had seen something in him worth saving, worth nurturing, worth loving. Even when the world turned away, the sound of footsteps outside the barn made Jake look up from the Bible, his heart jumping as he realized how vulnerable he was in this moment, how exposed. He quickly closed the book and slipped it into his jacket pocket, but not before Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight. "Jake," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been fear or might have been determination. "We need to talk." Jake rose slowly, every instinct screaming that this conversation would change everything, that the fragile piece he had built here was about to shatter like glass. Sarah's posture spoke of decisions made and lines crossed, of knowledge that couldn't be unknown. About what? He asked, though part of him already knew. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and bearing the unmistakable official seal of a wanted poster. Jake's blood turned to ice water as she unfolded it, revealing his younger face, sketched in crude detail above words that had haunted him for 20 years. "About this," Sarah said quietly, "about who you really are." Jake stared at the poster as if it were a living thing, a snake that had finally caught up to him after decades of pursuit. The Mustang stirred in her stall, sensing the sudden tension in the air, the shift in emotional atmosphere that animals read as clearly as weather patterns. "Where did you find that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my father's desk." He must have received it years ago, with all the other notices that come through. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she held the paper between them like evidence in a trial. "Jake, please tell me this isn't what it looks like. Please tell me you didn't kill my mother?" Jake finished, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "That's what you want to know, isn't it? Whether the man who's been gentling your Mustang, who's been sitting at your dinner table, who's been—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought, unable to name what had been growing between them. "I want to know the truth," Sarah said, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. "I want to hear it from you, not from some 20-year-old poster that might not tell the whole story." Jake looked at the woman who had become more important to him than breathing, who had offered him friendship when the world had offered only rejection. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else, hope, perhaps, or the possibility of understanding. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that I failed her. The night our cabin caught fire, I was asleep in the loft. I woke up to smoke and flames, and I couldn't reach her room. The roof was already starting to collapse, and the neighbors had to drag me out before I got myself killed trying to save her." Sarah's face softened, but Jake saw that she was still listening, still waiting for the rest of the story. The fire marshal said it was suspicious, said the burn pattern looked wrong for an accident. The insurance investigator started asking questions about money, about whether my father might have had reasons to want her dead. And when they found out that he had been drinking more, that they had been arguing about money, Jake's voice broke slightly. They decided someone in the family had set that fire, and since my father had an alibi and I didn't, they blamed a 12-year-old boy. Sarah finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. My father believed them, Jake said. The old pain as fresh as the day it happened. Looked at me in that hospital and saw a killer, not his son. By the time I was healed enough to leave, he was gone. Left me with relatives who made it clear I wasn't welcome, who whispered about the boy who might have murdered his own mother for inheritance money that never existed. The Mustang moved restlessly in her stall, responding to the emotional turbulence that filled the barn like smoke. Jake moved to her instinctively, his hands finding comfort in her warm presence, even as his world threatened to collapse around him. So you ran, Sarah said. Not a question, but an understanding. I ran, Jake confirmed. And I've been running ever since. 20 years of looking over my shoulder. 20 years of knowing that somewhere out there, people still think I'm a killer. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intense attention of someone trying to read truth in features and gestures. Do you think you could have saved her? She asked finally. The question struck Jake like a physical blow, cutting straight to the heart of his deepest fear. I don't know, he whispered. I was 12 years old, but I was already big for my age. Already strong enough to do a man's work. Maybe if I had been faster, braver, if I had ignored the smoke and the heat, you would have died with her, Sarah said firmly, and then there would have been 2 victims instead of 1. Maybe that would have been better, Jake said, the words torn from some deep place of pain. Maybe I should have died trying to save her instead of living with the knowledge that I didn't. Sarah stepped closer. Close enough that Jake could see the tears in her eyes, the compassion that had replaced fear and doubt. Jake Morrison, she said quietly, you were a child who lost everything and then was blamed for it by the very people who should have protected you. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, a wound that had festered for 20 years. Suddenly exposed to light and air. But what if they were right? He asked, his voice breaking. What if I could have saved her, and I was just too scared to try? Then you were human, Sarah said simply. Scared and small, and facing something no child should ever have to face. But Jake, listen to me. She reached out and touched his arm, her hand warm against the chill that seemed to have settled into his bones. The man I've come to know, the man who sat in a storm to comfort a frightened horse, who crafts leather with infinite patience, who plays lullabies in the dark. That man is not a killer. That man is someone who loves so deeply that he would rather blame himself than accept that sometimes terrible things happen to good people. The Mustang nickered softly, and Jake realized that his hands were shaking as he stroked her neck. You don't understand, he said desperately. They have my name on that poster. If anyone recognizes me, if word gets out that Jake Morrison is here, then we'll face it, Sarah said with quiet determination. Together. Jake stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You would do that? Even knowing what people think I am. I know what you are, Sarah said firmly. You're the man who taught me that gentleness is strength, that patience can accomplish what force never could. You're the man who made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond duty and obligation. The words hung between them like a bridge, an offer of connection that Jake had never dared to imagine. But even as his heart leaped toward the possibility she offered, practical considerations crashed back into his consciousness. If I stay, I put you in danger, he said. You and your father, this ranch, everything you built here. If the law, Comey's looking, then we'll prove your innocence, Sarah interrupted. 20 years is a long time, Jake. Maybe there's new evidence. Maybe the real truth has come to light. Maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting. Jake pulled his mother's Bible from his pocket, holding it like an anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. I don't know how to fight this, he admitted. I've been running so long, I've forgotten how to stand still and face what's coming. Sarah moved closer still, her hand covering his on the worn leather binding. Then learn, she said. Learn to stand still. Learn to trust that you don't have to face this alone. The Mustang pressed her head against Jake's shoulder, as if offering her own support to the man who had taught her that trust was possible. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of two beings who had chosen to see him clearly and love him anyway, Jake felt something shift inside his chest. There's something else, he said quietly, knowing that if he was going to trust Sarah with his life, he had to trust her with everything. Before I came here, I hadn't spoken my mother's name aloud in 20 years. I carried her memory like a wound that couldn't heal, something too precious and too painful to share. But being here, with you and with her, he gestured toward the Mustang. It's like learning to breathe again. Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. She would be proud of you, she said. Your mother. She would be proud of the man you became, of the kindness you've carried, despite everything that tried to break it. Jake opened the Bible to the passage he had been reading, showing Sarah the pressed flowers and his mother's careful notation. She wrote this for me, he said, about forgiveness and courage. I think maybe it's time I started listening. Sarah read the inscription carefully, her fingers tracing the faded ink with reverence. Forgiveness begins with forgiving yourself. She read aloud, Jake, maybe that's what this is about. Maybe you found your way here not to hide, but to heal. And if healing means facing the past, Jake asked, if it means risking everything we've built here, then we face it together, Sarah said again, her voice steady with conviction. But Jake, you have to make the choice. You can keep running, keep carrying this burden alone, or you can trust that some things are worth the risk. Jake looked around. The barn that had become his sanctuary, at the Mustang who had taught him that trust was possible, at the woman who had offered him something he had never dared to hope for. The safe choice would be to leave tonight, to disappear again into the vast anonymity of the frontier before anyone else discovered his secret. But safety had never brought him peace, had never healed the wounds that drove him from place to place like a ghost seeking rest. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting for the life he wanted to live. If I stay, he said slowly, if I choose to face this, there's no guarantee how it will end. The law might not care about new evidence or changed circumstances. They might just see a fugitive who's been running for 20 years. They might, Sarah agreed. But they might also see what I see, a good man who was wrongly accused, who deserves the chance to clear his name and live freely. Jake felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a mantle, heavy with consequences, but also with possibility. In his pocket, his mother's Bible seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him of her words about courage and forgiveness. The Mustang needs more time, he said finally, before she's ready for full work. Another week, maybe 2. Sarah smiled, understanding that he had made his choice. Then we use that time, she said. We prepare. We gather what evidence we can. We make sure that when the reckoning comes, we're ready for it. As if sensing the importance of the moment, the Mustang lifted her head and looked directly at Jake, her dark eyes full of trust and encouragement. Here was a creature who had learned to believe in tomorrow, despite a past full of pain, who had chosen love over fear when love was offered with an open heart. All right, Jake said, his voice growing stronger with each word. We stay. We fight. We find out once and for all what the truth is worth. Outside the barn, the Colorado night stretched endlessly toward the mountains, full of possibilities, both dark and bright. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight and newfound determination, two damaged souls and one wild horse prepared to face whatever dawn might bring. Sheriff Marcus Dolan wore his badge like a weight he had carried too long, the silver star tarnished by 20 years of difficult decisions and imperfect justice. He rode into the Broken Arrow Ranch on a gray morning when the clouds hung low over the mountains like a promise of rain, his horse picking its way carefully through the muddy yard while his eyes took inventory of everything he saw. Jake knew. The moment he spotted the lawman approaching, recognized the deliberate way the sheriff sat his horse, the careful attention to detail that marked a man accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. From the barn where he was working with the Mustang, Jake watched the sheriff's approach with the calm that comes after the decision to stop running has already been made. "Mr. Patterson," Sheriff Dolan called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I'm here on official business." Frank Patterson emerged from the ranch house, his face carefully neutral but his posture alert. Behind him, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her green eyes immediately seeking Jake's figure in the barn. The Mustang sensed the tension in the air, her ears pricked forward as she evaluated this new presence with the caution of a creature that had learned to read human intentions. "Sheriff," Frank acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out our way?" Dolan dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had absorbed too many years in the saddle, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a solid thunk. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a folded paper that Jake recognized even at a distance. The same wanted poster that had shattered his peace just days earlier. "Looking for this man," Dolan said, unfolding the poster so Frank could see. "Jake Morrison, wanted in connection with a murder in Tennessee." Got word that someone matching his description might be working ranches in this area. Frank studied the poster with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock, his weathered features giving nothing away. "What makes you think he's here?" "Anonymous tip came in 3 days ago," Dolan replied. "Someone claimed to have seen him working with horses, said he was unusually tall, and carried himself like a man with something to hide. Description fits the wanted man closely enough to warrant investigation." Jake's blood ran cold as he realized that someone had betrayed him, had seen through his attempts to blend into the background and disappear among the other drifters and ranch hands who made their living in the Colorado Territory. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm him, he found himself stepping out of the barn, the Mustang following close behind on her lead rope, as if she understood that he might need her support. "You looking for me, Sheriff?" Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. All eyes turned toward him as he approached, the Mustang moving with fluid grace beside him, her copper coat gleaming despite the overcast sky. Jake had grown accustomed to the way people stared at his size, but this felt different. The sheriff's gaze was evaluating, measuring, comparing the reality before him to the description on a 20-year-old poster. "You Jake Morrison?" Dolan asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "I am," Jake replied, stopping about 10 feet away from the group, close enough to speak clearly, far enough to avoid seeming threatening. "I suppose you have questions for me." Sheriff Dolan's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's scarred face, the gentle way he handled the lead rope, the complete absence of the desperation or aggression he usually encountered when confronting wanted men. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Morrison in Knox County, Tennessee, 20 years ago." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to disturb the very air around them. Sarah stepped forward from the porch, her face pale but determined. while Frank looked between his hired hand and the sheriff with the expression of a man realizing that his careful world was about to become complicated. "Sheriff," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jake could hear underneath. "Before you take him, there's something you should know. Something that might change how you look at this case." Dolan turned his attention to Sarah with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing final pleas and desperate explanations. "Miss Patterson, I appreciate your concern for your hired hand, but the law is the law. This man has been a fugitive for 20 years. From a crime he didn't commit," Sarah said firmly. "Sheriff, how much do you know about the details of that case? About what really happened the night Eleanor Morrison died?" For the first time, Dolan's professional certainty seemed to waver slightly. "I know what's in the file. House fire, suspicious. Circumstances, young Jake Morrison the only suspect with opportunity, and a scared 12-year-old boy who's blamed for something no child could have prevented." Sarah interrupted. "Sheriff, in 20 years, has anyone ever looked deeper into that case? Has anyone ever questioned whether a grieving child might have been an easy target for accusations that didn't hold up under scrutiny?" Jake felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah's fierce defense, but he also knew that emotional appeals rarely swayed the law. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I've been running for 20 years because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. But I'm not running anymore. If you need to arrest me, I won't resist. But I'd like the chance to tell you what really happened that night, if you're willing to listen." Dolan studied Jake with the sharp attention of a man who had learned to read truth and deception in faces and voices. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "Most wanted men don't surrender voluntarily or offer to explain themselves. Most wanted men are probably guilty of something," Jake replied. "I'm guilty of being too small to save my mother, too young to understand the politics that needed a scapegoat, and too afraid to stay and fight for the truth. But I'm not guilty of murder." The Mustang pressed closer to Jake's side, as if offering her own testimony to his character. Dolan's eyes tracked the movement, noting the way the horse sought comfort from the man, the obvious trust between them. "That's quite a horse," Dolan observed. "Heard you gentled the Mustang that nobody else could handle." "We gentled each other," Jake corrected. "Sometimes healing works both ways." Sheriff Dolan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Jake, the Mustang, and the poster in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its official edge. "Mr. Morrison, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've learned to tell the difference between a killer and a victim. But the law doesn't always make that same distinction." "I understand," Jake said. "I'm ready to face whatever comes next. Maybe you won't have to," Dolan said, reaching into his jacket for another piece of paper. "See, the funny thing about anonymous tips is that sometimes they come from people with their own agendas. And sometimes, when you start asking questions about old cases, you discover that the truth has been waiting for someone to care enough to look for it." Jake's heart stopped as Dolan unfolded what appeared to be an official document, signed and sealed with the authority of law. "What is that?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. "Deathbed confession," Dolan replied. "From a man named Caleb Morrison, your father, I believe. Died in a Tennessee prison 3 months ago, serving time for fraud and arson. Seems his conscience finally got the better of him." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jake absorbed the sheriff's words. His father, the man who had looked at him with such accusation and disgust, who had abandoned him to face the law alone, had finally told the truth. But only in death, only when it cost him nothing more than the confession of a guilty conscience. "What did he say?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Dolan unfolded the document carefully, his weathered hands treating it with the reverence due to evidence that could restore a man's life. "According to this, Caleb Morrison set that fire himself. Was drowning in gambling debts. Thought the insurance money would solve his problems. Didn't know his wife was still in the house when he lit the accelerant. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each revelation rewriting 20 years of guilt and self-doubt. He knew, Jake said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. He knew I was innocent, and he let them blame me anyway. Gets worse, Dolan continued grimly. Says here that when he realized Eleanor was trapped, he tried to go back. For her, but couldn't get through the flames. Found you trying to climb through a window to reach her. Pulled you out just before the roof collapsed. Then, when the investigators started asking questions, he pointed them toward you instead of admitting his own guilt. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes bright with unshed tears for the injustice Jake had endured. Frank Patterson stood, silent, his face grave as he absorbed the magnitude of what had been done to a child in the name of protecting a coward's secrets. 20 years, Jake said, the number carrying the weight of a lifetime lost to fear and isolation. 20 years of running from something I didn't do. 20 years of your father living with what he'd done, Dolan added. According to the prison chaplain who took this confession, Caleb Morrison was haunted by guilt. Drank himself into prison. Got into fights, couldn't hold down work. The chaplain said he'd been trying to work up the courage to confess for years. The Mustang sensed Jake's emotional turmoil and pressed closer, her warm presence grounding him in the moment even as his entire understanding of the past shifted and reformed. Jake's hand found her neck automatically, drawing comfort from the solid reality of her trust. Why now? Jake asked. Why did he finally tell the truth? Dying man's conscience, Dolan replied simply. And maybe because he heard through the prison grapevine that someone was asking questions about Jake Morrison, trying to track down the fugitive from Tennessee. Made him realize that his lies were still causing harm, still keeping an innocent man on the run. Sarah stepped forward, her face fierce with protective anger. Someone was hunting for Jake? Who? Dolan's expression darkened. That's where this gets interesting. The anonymous tip that brought me here came from a man who's been tracking Jake Morrison for years, convinced he could claim the reward money. Name of Slade Brennan, makes his living as a bounty hunter. Jake felt ice form in his veins at the name. He knew Brennan by reputation, a hard man who cared more about profit than justice, who had made a career of hunting fugitives with single-minded determination. The thought that such a man had been following his trail, getting closer with each passing year, made Jake's skin crawl. Where's Brennan now? Frank asked, his practical mind already considering the implications. That's the problem, Dolan admitted. I told him to stay in town while I investigated his tip, but Brennan's not the kind of man who takes orders well. He might decide to come out here himself, try to collect what he thinks is his due. As if summoned by their fears, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley, approaching fast and hard. Jake turned toward the sound, his body tensing with the instincts that had kept him alive through 20 years of flight. But this time, he didn't step back or look for escape routes. This time, he stood his ground. The rider who crested the hill was everything Jake had imagined and worse lean, and hard-faced with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to violence. Slade Brennan rode like he owned the world, his eyes fixed on Jake with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. Well, Brennan called out as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun. Jake Morrison, as I live and breathe. You've led me a hell of a chase, boy. Mr. Brennan, Sheriff Dolan said firmly, stepping between the bounty hunter and Jake. I told you to stay in town. Brennan's smile was cold as winter wind. And I told you that $500 is a lot of money to let slip away on technicalities. This man's a wanted killer, Sheriff. My job is to bring him in, dead or alive. Your job, Dolan replied with quiet authority, is to follow the law. and the law says that Jake Morrison is no longer a wanted man. The sheriff held up the confession document, and Jake saw Brennan's confidence waver for the first time. What's that supposed to be? Deathbed confession from the real killer, Dolan explained. Caleb Morrison admitted to setting the fire that killed his wife, admitted to letting his son take the blame. Jake Morrison has been cleared of all charges. Brennan's face darkened with rage and disappointment. 20 years of hunting, of following, cold trails and false leads had led him to this moment of potential profit, only to have it snatched away by an inconvenient truth. "I don't believe it," Brennan snarled. "Convenient timing, don't you think? Right when I finally track him down, suddenly there's new evidence?" "The confession is dated 3 months ago," Dolan said patiently, "and it's been verified by the Tennessee authorities. Jake Morrison is a free man." But Jake could see that Brennan wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. The bounty hunter's hand had moved closer to his gun, his posture shifting into the stance of a man preparing for violence. 20 years of hunting Jake Morrison had become an obsession, and obsessed men didn't let go easily. "Free man or not," Brennan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "he's been a fugitive for 20 years. Lot of laws broken in that time, lot of false names used. Might not be a killer, but he's still a criminal." The Mustang snorted and sidled closer to Jake, her ears pinned back as she read the threat in Brennan's voice and posture. Jake felt a moment of pure clarity, understanding that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he decided to stop running. "You're right," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "I did break laws. I used false names, worked under assumed identities, avoided the authorities for 20 years. But I was a child when it started, and I was afraid." He stepped forward, past Sheriff Doolan's protective stance, meeting Brennan's angry gaze with the calm that comes from finally accepting the truth of one's own life. "I'm not afraid anymore," Jake continued. "If there are consequences for the choices I made while running from a crime I didn't commit, I'll face them. But I won't run anymore, and I won't let fear make my decisions." Sarah moved to stand beside Jake, her presence a declaration of support that made his heart swell with gratitude and love. The Mustang pressed against his other side, completing a circle of trust that felt stronger than any shield. "Stand down, Brennan," Sheriff Dolan ordered, his own hand now resting on his weapon. "This man is under my protection." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Brennan's shoulders sagged with defeat, the fight going out of him as he realized that his obsession had led him to an empty victory. 20 years, he muttered, turning away from the group. 20 years for nothing. As Brennan mounted his horse and rode away, taking his bitter disappointment with him, Jake felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The fear that had driven him across half a continent was gone, replaced by something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope for a future that belonged to him. 6 months after, Sheriff Dolan rode away with Jake's exoneration papers. The foal arrived on a morning when spring painted the Colorado mountains in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise endless possibilities. She was perfect copper-colored like her mother, but with white markings that caught the early light like stars scattered across her coat. The newborn filly stood on impossibly long legs, testing her balance while her mother watched with the protective attention of someone who understood the preciousness of new life. Jake knelt in the straw beside them, his large hands gentle as he checked the foal for any signs of distress or injury. But she was healthy and strong, her dark eyes already bright with curiosity about the world into which she had been born. The Mustang, who Sarah had finally named Esperanza, Spanish for Hope, nuzzled her daughter with infinite tenderness before turning to acknowledge Jake's presence with a soft whinny of welcome. "She's beautiful," Sarah said from the stall doorway, her voice warm with wonder. The simple gold band on her left hand caught the lamplight as she moved. Still new enough that Jake sometimes found himself staring at it in amazement. 3 months. Married, and he still couldn't quite believe that someone had chosen to bind their life to his, had stood before God and community and promised to love him without reservation. The wedding had been simple, just Sarah and Jake, Frank Patterson, and Sheriff Dolan serving as witness. They had exchanged vows in the little church in town, the same place where whispers about the giant stranger had gradually given way to stories about the horse, whisperer who could gentle the wildest animals with nothing but patience and kindness. The wedding rings had been fashioned from silver dollars by the town blacksmith, plain bands that spoke of permanence and commitment rather than ostentation. "She has her mother's spirit," Jake observed, watching as the foal took her first tentative steps away from Esperanza's protective side. Independent but willing to trust. It was true. Even in her first hours of life, the filly showed signs of the same intelligence that had made her mother so special, the same careful evaluation of her surroundings that suggested she would be neither easily frightened nor easily fooled. But there was also something different about her, a willingness to investigate rather than flee, a confidence that came from being born into safety rather than surviving in the wild. Frank Patterson appeared behind Sarah, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he studied his newest asset. The Mustang breeding program had been Jake's idea, a way to combine Esperanza's exceptional bloodlines with gentle training methods that produced horses of unusual intelligence and tractability. Already, word was spreading throughout the territory about the Broken Arrow horses that worked with enthusiasm rather than resignation, that seemed to understand their riders' intentions before they were expressed. "That filly's going to be worth her weight in gold," Frank said with the practical appreciation of a man who understood livestock values. "Assuming Jake can work the same magic on her that he did with her mother." "It's not magic," Jake replied, rising from his crouch beside the foal. "It's just patience and respect. Animals know when you see them as partners instead of property." The transformation that had taken place at the Broken Arrow Ranch over the past 6 months had been remarkable. Word of Jake's methods had spread, bringing visitors from as far away as Denver and Santa Fe to observe the gentle giant, who could train horses without breaking their spirits. Some came as skeptics, convinced that force was the only language animals understood. Others came as believers, seeking to learn techniques that produced willing cooperation instead of grudging submission. Jake had started teaching, somewhat reluctantly, at first, sharing the philosophy his mother had instilled in him during those early years in Tennessee. "Every animal is an individual," he would tell his students, "with their own fears, their own hopes, their own ways of understanding the world. Your job isn't to impose your will on them, but to find a way to communicate that serves you both." The journal he had started with Esperanza had grown into something more systematic idea, record of training methods and philosophical approaches that visiting horsemen copied carefully and carried back to their own ranches. Sarah had suggested that he compile his observations into a proper book, something that could spread his methods even further. The idea still seemed impossible to Jake, the notion that his thoughts might be worth preserving in print, but he had begun to consider it seriously. "She needs a name," Sarah said, watching as the foal explored her stall with growing confidence. Jake considered various possibilities, thinking about the circumstances of her birth, the hope she represented for the future of gentle training methods, the promise of a new generation that would never know fear or force as teaching tools. "Aurora," he said finally. "Like the dawn, a new beginning." Sarah smiled, understanding the layers of meaning in the choice. Aurora represented more than just a horse's name. She was the symbol of everything Jake had built in this place. The proof that damaged things could heal and create something beautiful in the process. As if approving of her name. The foal lifted, Her head nickered softly, her voice clear and sweet in the morning air. Esperanza answered with her own gentle sound, and Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion at the perfect domesticity of the moment. "You know," Frank said, leaning against the stall door, "when I first hired you, I figured you might last a month. Giant like you, too gentle for ranch work, probably couldn't handle the isolation. Never expected you to become family." The word family still had the power to make Jake's chest tighten with gratitude and wonder. He had spent so many years believing that belonging was impossible for someone like him, that his differences would always mark him as an outsider. But here, in this place where broken things were allowed to heal, he had found not just acceptance, but love. Sometimes the best things come when you're not looking for them, Jake replied, his arm sliding around Sarah's waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Sarah leaned into his embrace, her own arm encircling his broad back as they watched Aurora take her first steps toward independence. "She's gonna be special," Sarah said. "You can see it already, the way she moves, the way she looks at the world. She's gonna change things, just like her mother did." Jake thought about the changes that had rippled out from his arrival. At the Broken Arrow Ranch, the way one frightened horse and one lonely man had created something that touched lives across the territory. Horsemen who had once relied on force were learning patience. Animals that had been written off as too difficult were finding new chances. And in the town below, children who had once hidden from the scary giant now waved when they saw him driving the wagon to market. "Change starts small," Jake said, thinking of his mother's words about pressed flowers and lasting beauty. One relationship at a time, one moment of trust building on another. Aurora stumbled slightly in her explorations, her legs still uncertain beneath her, but she recovered quickly and continued her investigation of her new world. Esperanza watched with the patient attention of a mother who understood that growth required both protection and freedom, both guidance and the space to make mistakes. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the barn in warm golden light that spoke of abundance and possibility. Soon, visitors would arrive to see the famous Mustang and her trainer, to learn about methods that seemed revolutionary, but were really as old as the first human who looked at an animal and chose partnership over dominion. But for now, in the quiet privacy of dawn, Jake Morrison stood with his wife and his father-in-law, watching a newborn filly take her first steps into a world where gentleness had proven stronger than force, where patience had accomplished what violence never could. He was no longer the frightened boy who had fled Tennessee with accusations burning in his ears. He was no longer the lonely drifter who had wandered from ranch to ranch, searching for a place where his differences wouldn't matter. He was Jake Morrison, husband and teacher, healer of broken horses, and keeper of ancient wisdom about the power of love to transform everything it touched. The full Aurora, dawn, new beginning, lifted her head and looked directly at Jake with dark eyes that seemed to hold the promise of all the mornings yet to come. In that gaze, he saw reflected not the giant that had frightened so many, but simply a man who had learned that asking, "Please don't turn me away," could change everything when spoken to the right heart at the right moment. And in the warm circle of family and hope, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses and the promise of spring, Jake Morrison finally understood that he had found his way home.